Hi guys, it's Miss Portillo. It's been about a week since I posted a chapter from our novel study, so we're going to continue that today on Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time. Remember, you can always go back and watch old videos to make sure that you can take additional notes and annotate, or if you forget something that's going on before I post the next video, you can always go check that. So far we've met several characters, and when we ended our last chapter, Charles Wallace's three friends, Mrs. Who, Miss Whatsit, and now Miss Witch, have shown up, and they say it's time to go. So they're about to go somewhere. You might also have noticed that Mrs. Witch, who showed up last, speaks a little bit of French, and she seemed to vanish and reappear. So it's starting to get more interesting, as promised. So let's just jump right into it. Don't forget to take your notes, especially plot or decoding words that you're not sure of. And let's see where they're going to go now. Chapter 4 is called The Black Thing. The trees were lashed into a violent frenzy. Meg screamed and clutched at Calvin, and Mrs. Witch's authoritative voice called out, "Quiet, child." So Mrs. Witch is the one who elongates her words, kind of like she's speaking like a snake. And Mrs. Who must be the one who actually speaks a little bit of French. Did a shadow fall across the moon? Or did the moon simply go out, extinguished as abruptly and completely as a candle? There was still the sound of leaves, a terrifying rushing. All light was gone, and the darkness was complete. Suddenly, the wind was gone, and all sound. Meg felt that Calvin was being torn from her. When she reached out, for her fingers touched nothing, she screamed out, "Charles!" And whether it was to help him or for him to help her, she did not know. The word was flung back down her throat, and she choked on it. She was completely alone. She had lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Charles was nowhere, either to save or to turn to. She was alone in a fragment of nothingness. No light, no sound, no feeling. Where was her body? She tried to move in her panic, but there was nothing to move. Just as light and sound had vanished, she was gone too. The corporeal Meg simply was not. Suddenly, she felt her limbs again. Her legs and arms were tingling faintly, as though they had been asleep. She blinked her eyes rapidly, but though she herself was somehow back, nothing else was. It was not as simple as darkness or an absence of light. Darkness has a tangible quality. It can be moved through and felt. In darkness, you can bark your shins. The world of things still exists around you. She was lost in a horrifying void. It was the same way with the silence. This was more than silence. A deaf person can feel vibrations. Here, there was nothing to feel. Suddenly, she was aware of her heart beating rapidly within the cage of her ribs. Had it stopped before? What had made it start again? The tingling in her arms and legs grew stronger, and suddenly she felt movement. This movement, she felt, must be the turning of the earth, rotating on its axis, traveling its elliptic course about the sun. And this feeling of moving with the earth was somewhat like the feeling of being in the ocean, out in the ocean beyond this rising and falling of the breakers, lying on the moving water, pushing gently with the swells, and feeling the gentle, inexorable tug of the moon. I'm asleep. I'm dreaming, she thought. I'm having a nightmare. I want to wake up. Let me wake up. Well, Charles Wallace's voice said, that was quite a trip. I do think you might have warned us. Light began to pulse and quiver. Meg blinked and shoved shakily at her glasses, and there was Charles Wallace, standing indignantly in front of her, his hands on his hips. "Meg," he shouted, "Calvin, where are you?" She saw Charles. She heard him, but she could not go to him. She could not shove through the strange, trembling light to meet him. Calvin's voice came as though it were pushing through a cloud. "Well, just give me time, will you? I'm older than you are." Meg gasped. It wasn't that Calvin wasn't there, and then that he was. It was that part of him came first and the rest of him followed, like a hand and then an arm, an eye and then a nose. It was a sort of shimmering, a looking at Calvin through water, through smoke, through fire. And then there he was, solid and reassuring. Meg, Charles Wallace's voice came. Meg, Calvin, where's Meg? I'm right here, she tried to say, but her voice seemed to be caught at its source. Meg, Calvin cried, and he turned around, looking about wildly. Mrs. Witch, you haven't left Meg behind, have you? Charles Wallace shouted. If you hurt Meg, any of you, Calvin started. But suddenly Meg felt a violent push and a shattering as though she had been thrust through a wall of glass. Oh, there you are, Charles Wallace said, and rushed over to hug her. But where am I? Meg asked breathlessly, relieved to hear that her voice was now coming out of her in more or less a normal way. She looked around rather wildly. They were standing suddenly in a sunlit field, and the air about them was moving with the delicious fragrance that comes only on the rarest of spring days when the sun's touch is gentle and the apple blossoms are just beginning to unfold. So they were at home. It was dark, and then it got very windy and scary, and it seemed that they all disappeared. She couldn't feel her body or herself anymore. And then, all of a sudden, they're in a bright, sunlit field with flowers, and it seems like springtime. It makes you wonder what's going on there. They had left the silver glint of a biting autumn evening, and now around them everything was golden with light. The grasses of the field were tender new green, and scattered about were tiny multicolored flowers. Meg turned slowly to face a mountain reaching so high into the sky that its peak was lost in a crown of puffy white clouds. From the trees at the base of the mountain came a sudden singing of birds. Sorry, guys, lost my page. There was an air of such ineffable peace and joy all around her that her heart's wild thumping slowed down. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Came Mrs. Who's voice. Suddenly, the three of them were there. Miss Whatsit with her pink stole askew, Mrs. Who with her spectacles gleaming, and Mrs. Witch, still little more than a shimmer. Delicate, multicolored butterflies were fluttering about them, as though in greeting. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who began to giggle, and they giggled until it seemed that, whatever their private joke was, they would fall down with the wild fun of it. The shimmer seemed to be laughing too. It became vaguely darker and more solid, and then there appeared a figure in a black robe and a black peaked hat, beady eyes, a beaked nose, and long gray hair, one bony claw clutching a broomstick. Well, just to keep you girls happy, the strange voice said. So that's Mrs. Witch that finally appeared. And Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who fell into each other's arms in gales of laughter. If you ladies have had your fun, I think you should tell Calvin and Meg a little more about all of this, Charles Wallace said coldly. You scared Meg half out of her wits, whisking her away in this without any warning. Mrs. Who intoned, hoarse, to action little, less to words inclined. Mrs. Who, I do wish you'd stop quoting. Charles Wallace sounded very annoyed. Mrs. Whatsit adjusted her stole. But she finds it so difficult to verbalize, Charles dear. It helps her if she can quote instead of working out words of her own. And we mustn't lose our senses of humor, Miss Witch said. The only way to cope with something deadly serious is to try to treat it a little lightly. But that's going to be hard for Meg, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's going to be hard for her to realize that we are serious. What about me? Calvin asked. The life of your father isn't at stake, Mrs. Whatsit told him. What about Charles Wallace, then? Mrs. Whatsit's unoiled door-hinge voice was warm with affection and pride. Charles Wallace knows. Charles Wallace knows that it's far more than just the life of his father. Charles Wallace knows what's at stake. But remember, Miss Who said, nothing is hopeless. We must hope for everything. Where are we now, and how did we get here? Calvin asked. Uriel, the third planet of the star Malik in the Spiral Nebula Messier 101. This I'm supposed to believe? Calvin asked indignantly. As you like, Miss Witch said coldly. For some reason, Meg felt that Miss Witch, despite her looks and broomstick, was someone in whom one could put complete trust. It doesn't seem any more peculiar than anything else that's just happened. Well then, someone tell me just how we got here. Calvin's voice was still angry, and his freckles seemed to stand out on his face. Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take us years and years to get here. Oh, we don't travel at the speed of anything, Miss Whatsit explained. We tesser, or you might say, we wrinkle. Clear as mud, Calvin said. Tesser, Meg thought. Could that have anything to do with Mother's tesseract? She was about to ask when Mrs. Witch started to speak, and one did not interrupt when Miss Witch was speaking. Miss Whatsit is young and naive. She keeps thinking she can explain things in words, Mrs. Who said. The more a man knows, the less he talks. But she has to use words for Meg and Calvin, Charles reminded Mrs. Who. If you brought them along, they have a right to know what's going on. Meg went up to Mrs. Witch. In the intensity of her question, she had forgotten all about the tesseract. Is my father here? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not here, Meg. Let Miss Whatsit explain. She is young, and the language of words is easier for her than it is for Miss Who and me. We stopped here, Mrs. Whatsit explained, more or less to catch our breaths, and to give you a chance to know what you're up against. But what about Father? Meg asked. Is he all right? For the moment, love, yes. He's one of the reasons we're here. But you see, he's only one. Well, where is he? Please take me to him. We can't. Not yet, Charles said. You have to be patient, Meg. But I'm not patient, Meg cried passionately. I've never been patient. Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. To stake one's life for the truth. This is what we must do. That is what your father is doing, Miss Whatsit nodded, her voice like Mrs. Who's, very serious, very solemn. Then she smiled her radiant smile. Now, why don't you three children wander around and Charles can explain things a little. You're perfectly safe on Uriel. That's why we stopped here to rest. But aren't you coming with us? Meg asked fearfully. There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Witch raised her authoritative hand. Show them, she said to Mrs. Whatsit, and at something in her voice Meg felt prickles of apprehension. Now? Mrs. Whatsit asked, her creaky voice rising to a squeak. Whatever it was Mrs. Witch wanted them to see, it was something that made Mrs. Whatsit uncomfortable too. Now, Miss Witch said, they may as well know. Should I change? Mrs. Whatsit asked. Better. I hope it won't upset the children too much, Miss Whatsit murmured, as though to herself. Should I change too? Miss Who asked. Oh, but I've had fun in these clothes. But I'll have to admit, Mrs. Whatsit is the best at it. The work proves the craftsman. Shall I transform now too? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not yet. Not here. You may wait. Okay. So it is starting to get very, very interesting. We know from the beginning how Meg feels about herself We know that the family has problems with their father missing. We know that Charles Wallace introduces the three female characters, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, and Mrs. Witch. And they all seem a little bit off. There's something a little bit weird about them. Each one of them has something different. So they bring in Calvin when Meg and Charles Wallace go one day after school to visit the haunted house. And it seems like Calvin was naturally supposed to be with them. They get along with him right away and form a bond. And when they go into the haunted house, they meet Mrs. Who. And then later, Calvin goes back to the house, their house with them, has dinner. And then as the story progresses, all of a sudden, all three of these women, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Witch, show up at their house on autumn or fall night when it's chilly and cold, and magically whisks them away through a tesser or a wrinkle. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept or have heard something about time travel. So it seems like we can infer they are wrinkling time or bending time in order to appear somewhere else. And now they're talking about being on a completely strange, weird planet in a different galaxy they've never heard of before. So they've wrinkled time to come to a new place. They've started talking about her father, and the ladies are talking about transforming. So hopefully by now you can see that this book does have supernatural elements, some fantasy elements, and that's where the book starts to get really, really interesting. So I hope you took some good notes, and don't forget you can always go back and watch these videos over and over and over again. That way you're less confused. It's like watching a movie. Sometimes if you watch it a second time, you see something you missed before. All right? Leave me a message in the comments or on Class Dojo. Message me and let me know what you think, or message me with some predictions that you might want to make about the book and what's going to happen in the future. All right, guys, I hope you're staying happy, healthy, and safe. Enjoy your time with friends and loved ones, and I'll see you next time.